Johns Hopkins Science Review, presented by the Johns Hopkins Institutions and WAAM in Baltimore, in cooperation with the DuMont Television Network. The Johns Hopkins Institutions have been famed for 77 years for their contributions to science and the humanities. Here in their many laboratories, Hopkins scientists are constantly probing into the secrets of science, which, when solved, are translated into benefits to be enjoyed by you. Each week, we look over the shoulders of today's scientists and catch a glimpse of the results of their research. On this, our 234th program, we examine the emotion called fear. Here to introduce this week's program from the Johns Hopkins University is Lynn Poole.
What you have just seen demonstrated, well, demonstrates many facts about many fears. Once you understand your fear and place it in the proper perspective, you probably won't be frightened. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that fears are not natural, because they are. Frights are natural. Perhaps like this one, for example. Well, this is a very natural reaction. But some of our fears, if they are occurring over and over again, they may become phobias. And a phobia is something that is difficult to get rid of, but we must try and find the cause of that phobia. If you'll forgive me by using a personal experience of my own. At one time, I crashed in an elevator in a building. And it wasn't a very pleasant experience, it was a very frightening experience. What I should have done was to have gone across the lobby of that building, gotten into another elevator and ridden to the top and come back to the bottom again. But like the man who refuses to get back on a horse after he was thrown, I didn't do it. So I was frightened of elevators, and I wouldn't go in them for a long time. But finally I realized the cause of my fear. I went into elevators and, realizing the cause of the fear, overcoming it, I'm now able to go up and down in elevators all the time. Well, many of the fears that we run into week after week or month after month in our lives are very common fears. But what are these fears? And what is a phobia? Well, now, our guest this week is a member of the Department of Psychology at Johns Hopkins University, and he can tell us this. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Marvin Bosch.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Fear is one of the most important emotions that we have. In its proper place, it is a valuable response. Out of place, it is most destructive. Today, most of our fears are out of place. And for that reason, it is most important that we master them. Some examples of fears that are out of place in our life today are fears of darkness, fears of high places, fears of open places, and so forth. The emotion of fear is the expression of a strong desire to escape from a perceived danger. The most prominent feelings associated with fear are the bodily sensations which are produced by that portion of your nervous system known as the autonomic nervous system. You have all experienced these at one time or another: pounding of the heart, sinking in the stomach, trembling and shaking, weakness and tension. Now, there are several ways that we can measure the extent of the fear reaction. I have said before that under conditions of extreme fear, the heart beats more rapidly. And there are other responses that we all recognize. One way in which we can measure the degree of the fear response is by means of the galvanic skin response. Let's watch as Dr. Charles Erickson performs an experiment which some of you may remember from this program some years ago.
Are those too tight?
No, they're all right.
All right, now just relax. This is forbidding equipment here. Isn't going to be very threatening to you. Just relax and take it easy. This apparatus we have on your hands here is to measure your skin resistance. Although you don't feel it, a very weak electrical current is being passed through your hands, and it's being recorded, the amount is being recorded on this pointer, on that dial over there. Now, we know from past experience that in a frightening or emotional situation, the resistance of a person's skin changes very markedly. It drops, and if you'll note that if you were frightened now, this needle would make a very marked jump in this direction, and then gradually return to normal again. Now, the electrodes we have on your wrist and around your ankle are hooked to this amplifier through various circuits, and finally, you will hear your heart amplified and will come out with a sound of pump, pump, pump. We'll turn it on now, and in just a moment when the apparatus warms up, you'll hear your heart going. It'll be a little background noise, and then there'll be a pump, 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 pump. Here? No. Relax. Back. Harmless snake. That was a rather dirty trick to pull on you, wasn't it? This snake is perfectly harmless. He isn't going to hurt you. Listen to your heart going now. Hear that increase? Now, you probably didn't see this, but the audience can probably see this marked movement of the needle in this direction. A very big movement over there. This was due to the fright, the sudden drop in your skin resistance when the snake was presented. Now, if we may as well turn this off now so we can hear a little better. Now, if we had been recording this on graph paper, you'd see a record pretty much similar to what you're going to see in the chart now. Now, you'll notice on the first line of the chart is a heart action, the rate at which the heart is beating. And initially, the heart is very constant, and you see at the point at which the snake was presented that the heart suddenly had a very increase in rate, a very big increase in rate. Then, on the lower line, you see the initial level of skin resistance. It was fairly constant, and then when the snake was presented, there was a sudden drop, and then gradually as the frightening situation faded away, skin resistance returned again to normal. Now, I hope you aren't too angry about what I did to you. You certainly were frightened, weren't you?
Certainly was.
Well, let's go talk a bit about it. There's much that can be done to help people overcome and to get rid of the part.
We have said that fear can be a valuable response. The young lady's fear of snakes could cause her to run away from a snake which might be poisonous. Certainly, if you were walking in the woods and met a wild animal, you would want to move away from it as quickly as possible. And your fear response would, by releasing adrenaline from the adrenal glands, provide you with the emergency energy to help you move faster. Now, we should distinguish between fear and caution, although the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. We often say that we fear excessive speeds in automobiles. Actually, we recognize such dangers and try to avoid them. If, however, the danger should become immediate, we may have a fear response. And afterwards, perhaps the delayed symptoms of weakness, fatigue, and exhaustion. Now, if our fear reaches the point where we have a fear response every time we step into an automobile, regardless of who is driving, then the fear has become irrational. For a very simple reason, fears are more likely to become pathological than are other emotions. The way to prevent an emotion from becoming pathological is to adjust at once to the emotion-producing situation. If we are aroused to anger, we usually fight and either win or lose. Such immediate adjustment prevents pathological development. With fears, however, the situation is quite different. Fear itself indicates that we have failed to make an adequate adjustment. It creates uncertainty. If we do not make an immediate adjustment, we remain in a state of tension. Now, as we have said before, the organism must adjust to the situation, or it remains in a state of tension for long periods of time. When this happens, it is evident that such violent upset cannot persist for very long without causing trouble. Now, fears which do persist may cause the person to become anxious. The anxious person is in a continual state of morbid dread. He worries about his finances, about his business, about his relations with other people, about his health, and even about his anxiety. Such anxiety is a fear that one lacks the ability to master the everyday problems of life. Now, when such fears become associated with specific objects, we call them phobias. Because abnormal fears can develop about almost any object of our experience, the number of phobias is very large. Let's look at some of the phobias which are fairly common in our present way of life.
In many instances, a fear response is attached to a specific type of situation, and it is then known as a phobia. One example of such a fear response is acrophobia, the fear of height. This is an illustration of a case study of a young man afflicted with acrophobia. In his particular case, it was determined that his irrational fear of height developed from a childhood incident when an older child held him suspended by his ankles from a high wall and threatened to drop him. Although this episode had long been repressed within his memory, he suffered from morbid anxiety whenever he stood at the brink of a height. He'd become nervous, giddy, and his heart would pound. He experienced a definite fear of falling, or a fear that he might jump over the brink, and would hastily draw back to a safer position. The uncomfortable feeling would persist for several seconds, leaving him weak and shaken. Claustrophobia is a fear response which is quite common. It indicates the fear of closed rooms or small spaces such as telephone booths or elevators. Those who suffer from claustrophobia in its more severe form feel that the very walls of the room are closing in on them. Some persons with milder forms of claustrophobia are uncomfortable when passing through a narrow street or a tunnel. More unusual is xylophobia, the fear of woods or forests, although no less real to those afflicted with it. In some instances, these people do not suffer a fear reaction when driving through a wooded area, but cannot force themselves to walk alone in the forest. As with all phobias, some incident in their lives, usually when very young, has left them with an intense and irrational fear. The fear of large open spaces is called agoraphobia. The sufferers from agoraphobia experience a mounting dread, particularly when alone in a large open field or meadow. This fear is the exact opposite of claustrophobia, and its victims feel a growing panic which forces them to hurry to a more enclosed area, where they can once more feel secure. Monophobia is the morbid fear of being alone. Its victims grow more and more uneasy when by themselves. They constantly seek companionship and only feel comfortable when in the company of others. When alone for a prolonged period, the uneasiness they feel at first grows into a fear response. They become physically uncomfortable and nervous. Their hearts pound and they perspire excessively, till they can again feel that people are around them. Zoophobia is, as the name implies, the morbid fear of animals. This is not the more normal fear which anyone might experience in an unexpected meeting with a wild animal. Merely looking at the animals at the zoo, no matter how securely caged, results in a fear response. Normally, the sufferer from zoophobia would avoid a visit to the zoo, knowing of his irrational fear. The victim of this phobia rarely fears just one specific animal. All animals create fear within him. Some people who have no fear of such large caged animals nevertheless fear certain animals, even such a small one as this mouse. Even though a person with such a phobia admits that her fear is groundless, she is still unable to control it. Birds also create a morbid fear in some individuals. An uncaged bird near them may cause an extreme feeling of panic with the usual fear reaction. Even our domestic animals can create a fear response in some victims of irrational fears. Careful observation of infants and small children have shown that dogs, cats, rats, birds, and insects do not produce uniform or native reactions of fear. Psychologists believe that emotional responses to such stimuli must be learned. The usual reaction of children to such pets as the cat is favorable and pleasurable. Only if they have experienced some unusual situation with corresponding fear reaction do they become afraid of animals. The child in this case is experiencing a normal reaction. He's not afraid of the cat. In fact, he decides to take it home. He is unaware that his mother suffers from ailurophobia, a dread of cats. The instant the cat is brought near to her, she experiences a sudden irrational fear which is uncontrollable, probably a result of an unhappy childhood experience. Unfortunately, this reaction may in turn affect her son's emotions toward animals. Bacteriophobia is the fear of germs. Extreme cases of this fear may be deep-seated and require psychiatric treatment. In this instance, the victim has a compulsion in connection with the phobia. A compulsion is a routine that gives a sense of security. Here it is illustrated by wiping off all objects before touching them, and by continually washing the hands after handling any object. Still another fear is dramophobia. This is a morbid fear of crossing the street. Its victims will go to any length to avoid such crossings, even to taking the long way round. Topophobia is the morbid fear of certain places. A typical example, which is quite common, is stage fright. Some individuals who make their living by personal appearances have this fear in varying degrees. Here you see an example of topophobia. In extreme cases, the fear reaction, together with the nervousness and unpleasant physical sensations which follow, may prevent the victim from continuing with his work. The list of phobias might be continued endlessly. A fairly common fear in children is nyctophobia, or fear of the darkness. Others are fear of machines, dread of anything new, the fear of needles or pointed objects, even phobophobia, the fear of being afraid.
Now, these are some of the fears that Dr. Shaw tells us are very common. And I'm awfully glad at this point that they are very common, because when I introduced him a few minutes ago, I forgot his last name. Now, I'm going to ask him later exactly what sort of a fear this is, but you see, I don't think I will do it again, because I realize why I did it, and subconsciously I was afraid I was going to do it, because I introduced Dr. Shaw as Dr. Marvin Rausch. And why did I do it? Because I know a man by the name of Marvin Rausch. And, well, I just did it. But I realize why I did it, and I don't think that I will do it again. But how can we overcome these fears, these phobias? Well, before we answer that, let's go back and see how Dr. Charles Erickson is making out with the young lady, helping her to overcome her fear of snakes.
Better now?
Just a little bit.
Well, what we have done, we have explained to Miss Petroff that this is perfectly harmless snake. We have shown her that it is. We let the snake try and bite us and shown that there's no effect whatsoever from it. And she's also had an opportunity to handle it and pet it a bit herself. Now she thinks it may be rather cute. It does have rather pretty colors to it. But the way with most fears, that once we have been told and really can verify for ourselves that the situation is not really a dangerous one, that it's something which we can verify and make certain that the danger, or just what the danger is, the fear is reduced a great deal. In other words, experience with a situation is able to reduce our fears of it. Familiarity removes many of the dangerous feelings that we get in a situation. The more familiar we become, the less dangerous or less frightened we are. Now, many of the things which we're frightened of have a good basis. Many snakes are poisonous. And the instinctive reaction of fear, then in that case, is a perfectly normal one. Now, I'm sure she'd be able to hold it now since we have talked a bit about this. She's had it demonstrated to her that the snake is perfectly harmless, and she's held it before. Do you want to take him again? Take his head there so he doesn't get away and run around the studio. Wouldn't be very feasible. Well, you're still a little leery of him, aren't you?
Just a little bit.
That's fine. Well, I think that if we had her hooked up to the equipment this time, that she'd still show a slight reaction when we presented the snake to her. However, I don't believe it would be nearly as marked as the first reaction. Her heart would not nearly increase as much as it did the last time, nor would the change in her skin resistance be nearly as great. It does show that with familiarity and with proper assurances, people can overcome this rather blind emotional reaction that tends to dominate their behavior. They can hold it in check and act rationally in a situation where previously they've been pretty much disorganized.
Well, I'm very glad at the moment because Dr. Shaw just whispered to me and said that we're still friends, even though I gave an unknowing demonstration of topophobia. Well, now, what about these very unreasonable, these deep-seated phobias? One thing the psychologists tell us is that we shouldn't say it's all in your imagination. Forget it. There's nothing to it. I'm sure that Dr. Shaw would agree when I say that the first thing that must be done is to find out the cause of a deep-seated phobia.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Poole. Studies of large numbers of people suffering from phobias have shown that most phobias date from an intense fear-producing experience, usually occurring in childhood. Laboratory experiments have demonstrated that children are afraid of pain, rough handling, sudden loud noises, and loss of support. Generally speaking, we can say that children are afraid of any situation to which they have not been adjusted. An experiment to demonstrate the emotional conditioning of children was conducted by Watson and Rayner as early as 1921. The subject was an 11-month-old child. The baby had previously shown only favorable responses to a dog, a cat, a white rabbit, and a toy rat. The conditioning was accomplished by presenting the child with a toy rat and producing a loud sound just as he reached for it. The child immediately showed an emotional reaction. After several combined stimulations of this sort, the toy rat was presented alone, and the child immediately cried and tried to crawl away. Thus, he was taught to fear a harmless and previously acceptable object. Psychologically, after several pairings of this sort, the child feared also rats that were alive, rabbits, dogs, and even other fuzzy toys, thus illustrating that such conditioned responses can become generalized. Psychologically, the processes of conditioning in everyday life are the same as in the laboratory, although they are seldom as efficiently observed or controlled. Now, because of the circumstances under which the fear-producing experience usually occurs, the sufferer usually does not remember the specific incident. It has produced a shame, fear, guilt, and so on, so that he is actually unable to recall it of his own accord. With the use of special techniques used by psychologists and psychiatrists, he may recall the fear-producing experience. Upon recall, the phobia is greatly lessened. If he is made to understand that the particular incident was the cause of the phobia and that it was unreasonable, then he improves. And after repeating it and assimilating it, the phobia disappears.
Well, I think it's very heartening to us to realize what Dr. Shaw says, that our phobias will disappear if we can find out the cause of those phobias. Just like the little girl at the door with the mask. When you open the door suddenly, you may have a fright, but you realize that it's only a child with a mask on. And I'm going to unmask this little lady here. Terry, come over here a minute, will you? Because if you ever see this little lady like this, and you get a quick fright, well, you don't have to worry, because it's just a very charming, pretty little lady. And I've got to introduce her, and I know I won't forget her name. It's little Terry Fenwick. So you see, when you realize that there is a reason for fear, you can overcome it. And we very much hope that you'll be with us next week when the Johns Hopkins Science Review presents another program which you individual viewers and many groups have asked us to do again. So be with us when we present He is an Epileptic.
Due to the large number of requests from individuals and organizations interested in epilepsy, next week the Johns Hopkins Science Review will repeat the program of several weeks ago on that subject. We hope that the many of you who have requested this program be repeated for the benefit of friends and relatives will have those people watching when we bring you once again, He is an Epileptic. The Johns Hopkins Science Review is produced by Lynn Poole, in association with Robert Fenwick and John Lockwood. Directed by Kennard Kelfie and Herbert B. Cahan. Art direction by Barry Mansfield. Your narrator has been Ted Jaffe. Portions of this program have been mechanically reproduced. The Johns Hopkins Science Review originates in the studios of WAAM in Baltimore. This, the DuMont Television Network.